Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox. I'm the Compliance Evangelist, and I'd like to welcome you to This Week in FCPA, Episode 80, for the week ending December 15th, 2017, the Last Jedi edition. This week, Jay and I take a wide-ranging look at a veritable potpourri of compliance and ethics-related stories. There are several stories around the 40th anniversary of the FCPA going up. We look at several of them. Dick Casson starts a series on the top FCPA enforcement actions, and Jessica Tillman throws in her thoughts as well. Law 360 runs an expert analysis series of reflections from some of the key players in FCPA enforcement over the past 40 years, including an article by Kara Brockmeyer and Chuck Duross on their work to help create the 2012 FCPA Resource Guide. The new revenue recognition rules are here. We touch on Tammy Whitehouse's piece, not Winehouse. Sorry about that, Tammy. Her piece in Compliance Week, and then also talk about Matt Kelly and myself's 5-part special podcast series in Compliance Into the Weeds on the topic. In honor of the latest premiere of a Star Wars movie, The Last Jedi, which came out today, we talk about the blog posts by myself on the FCPA Compliance Report, and also those by Doug Cornelius, who's had a week-long run on his site, Compliance Building. Jay and I are proud to announce our 5-part podcast series, May the Podcast Be With You, running the week of December 11th, where we take a look at the intersection of Star Wars and compliance. A new episode will be released each day at noon Central Standard Time. We take a look at a question posed by Mike Volkov, who asked if the new FCPA Corporate Enforcement Policy has altered the balance between disclosure and non-disclosure of FCPA violations. We take a look at an article by Sam Rubenfeld asking, do U.S. sanctions and U.S. sanctions policy work? And also another article by Sam where he detailed HSBC successfully exiting its 5-year deferred prosecution agreement. Also, we talk about Matt Kelly and his really exploration of the sentencing of Oliver Schmidt, the former VW compliance professional who was sentenced to 7 years for his role in the emission testing scandal. Finally, we touch upon my podcast series this month and my 1 month to a more effective compliance program series. This month is 1 month to better written standards and how written standards are the backbone of your compliance program. This is Tom Fox. Thank you very much for listening to this episode of This Week in FCPA. This Week in FCPA is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network. Hello, everyone. Tom Fox here, the Compliance Evangelist, back for another episode of This Week in FCPA, Episode 80, for the week ending December 15th, 2017, the Last Jedi edition. As always, I'm joined by my co-host and cohort, Jay Rosen, Mr. Monitors. Jay, welcome.
Thanks, Tom. We've got a nice potpourri of ethics and compliance stories, so why don't we jump right in the spirit of The Last Jedi?
Indeed. So, Jay, our good friend Dick Casson, editor-in-chief of the FCPA blog, posted a really interesting piece that I think you're going to follow up with by one of the other editors posting. But Dick asked, since the FCPA became law in December 1977, the DOJ has brought some 300 enforcement actions. Which one is the most important? And so he went through and detailed some of the ones that he thought were the most important. He really didn't take a look at or identify his most important, but it was, I think, designed to really start a conversation, which he did, and you're going to follow up with a post by Jessica Tillman on this. But he looked at cases such as Telia, Siemens, the Halliburton joint venture case, TSKJ, Jack Stanley, the Africa Sting. He pointed to the U.S. versus K, which was not an enforcement action. It was actually a criminal trial. And took a look at what they may have meant in terms of interpreting the FCPA and FCPA enforcement going forward. So I really like it when Dick leads thought and leads thought leadership, and he puts concepts and ideas out there really for the rest of us to discuss, and it fits exactly in line with what he desires the FCPA blog to be, which is the bulletin board for FCPA compliance. So kudos to Dick, and I know Jessica Tillman, as I said, had a post follow-up, so why don't you tell us about that?
Sure. So, one of the things she teaches in her class, she says, is that she still teaches the Siemens case because the facts are just jaw-dropping. The corruption involved more than $1.4 billion in bribes to government officials in Asia, Africa, Europe, the Middle East, and the Americas. So it was really a worldwide case. It showed a lot of cooperation amongst German authorities, U.S. authorities, and other global authorities. And back then, the DOJ said that beginning in the mid-90s, Siemens AG engaged in a systematic effort to falsify its corporate books and records and knowingly failed to implement and circumvent existing internal controls. So a lot of those things are now, we look for that regularly in most situations when there may be an FCPA issue. And she kind of bookends the Siemens thing with the Walmart matter. And although we have not seen a settlement yet, we've been hoping for one in the last 2 years, she still feels that it is such a large case, and the reason that it saw the light of day was when there was an expose in the New York Times for which reporters David Barstow and Alejandro Zanuck von Bertrab won a Pulitzer Prize. So I think in Jessica's mind, we have the scope and the scale and the cooperation of Siemens, and then we have Walmart now that, although they haven't settled, they have, without a doubt, one of the best ethics and compliance programs that about $750 million combined.
So one of the things that has been debated in the FCPA commentariat, Jay, is sort of a two-part question, I think, which is what's the purpose or the role of the Department of Justice? Is it there simply to bring criminal actions to enforce the FCPA, or is it there to encourage compliance through its enforcement, but also working with corporations really as partners? And we heard Rod Rosenstein specifically talk about that in his November speech where he announced the new FCPA Corporate Enforcement Policy. If we use that Department of Justice dichotomy specifically as to Walmart, let me just follow up on the last point you touched upon, which is the nearly $1 billion in spend that Walmart has put out, both to upgrade and remediate their compliance program, but also as part of their investigation. So is the lesson, and we don't know what sanction, if any, will be levied upon Walmart, although I believe they've reserved some, I believe it's $283 million they've publicly announced. And when a company reserves that for settlement, that's usually a pretty good sign that will be the monetary sanction. So is that too low? Is that too high? Is the Department of Justice ignoring something that went actually to the Walmart board of directors or to the CEO level? We've had numerous resignations of Walmart people who were involved in the incidents in question, although they go back really to the early part of last decade. Certainly the CEO at the time of the incident resigned shortly after the New York Times broke the story. So it's really encapsulates, I think, many of the questions that have been going back and forth about what is everyone's role in all of this. And I think I don't pretend to have the answers right now, and I think we'll be debating them even after the Walmart settlement comes down, because eventually there will be a settlement. But lots of different questions raised by Walmart, lots of different questions raised by Dick Cassin's post and Jessica's follow-up post, and I think they're all ripe for debate.
Yeah, and I think this sets the stage. Why don't we skip over number two for a second and go into Mike Volkov's article from earlier this week. And Mike is talking about calculating the new balance between disclosure and non-disclosure of potential FCPA violations. And I think that really dovetails with the point you just brought up, Tom. And with the new corporate enforcement policy that's been made part of the U.S. Attorney's Guide, there is a strong desire on the government's part here at this point to provide transparency and provide a known outcome. So if you kind of take the new changes here and you look at what is the DOJ's job, in this specific instance, they are giving a company, provided it's not a recidivist, a roadmap on how to go forward. So in this case, I think that their goals of coming up with this new policy and communicating it to the business world is really trying to teach them the right way to go ahead and to deal with any mishaps that come up corporately for them. What do you think?
So the new corporate FCPA Corporate Enforcement Policy clearly, at least clearly to me, communicated the government's desire to move to a broader remit of influencing not only more and more robust compliance programs in organizations, but also to help fight the worldwide scourge against bribery and corruption by enlisting corporations to do better on the business side of things. The department has consistently talked about international enforcement efforts. The DOJ, the Sessions DOJ has talked about that. Ken Blanco, Rod Rosenstein, even Jeff Sessions in his limited FCPA-focused remarks talked about international enforcement. So I think there's several different things going on here. And what Mike has done in his blog post entitled Calculating the New Balance Between Disclosure and Non-Disclosure of Potential FCPA Violations has really laid out some of the specific criteria that I think both outside counsel, in-house counsel, and boards of directors are going to have to consider when making the decision to self-disclose, because the balance, the DOJ is trying to shift the balance to make it more appealable to companies. They can certainly do that, and they have done that by creating a presumption of a declination and then reduction for not only self-disclosure but extensive cooperation and remediation. The one thing that the Department of Justice can't control is other actions, other civil actions, shareholder actions, your investigative cost. So companies really have a larger calculation to make than simply the dollar fine that they may or may not receive and the full declination they may or may not receive, their declination with disgorgement they may or may not receive. There's also your loss of reputational, through reputational damage. You could have, your stock could take a hit. Certainly a shareholder lawsuit's a given in with active shareholder litigation bar or shareholder derivative lawsuit bar. And a wide variety of other sanctions as well. Also, you could be opening yourself up to penalties, civil or criminal penalties in countries outside the United States where you engaged in bribery and corruption. So there's really lots to think about. What I think Mike has demonstrated clearly in his blog post is the Department of Justice has controlled the things that it can control, which are the amount of the fine and penalty. And by offering these reductions literally down to 100%, they have really incentivized companies to be a part of the solution or a part of the remedy in fighting bribery and corruption.
And I think one more interesting point he added is he says that, you don't necessarily have to disclose, but if you're going to conduct an internal investigation, you need to go in depth, you need to follow all the leads, terminate those bad actors who were responsible for conduct, including supervisory personnel who may have known what happened. And this entire process, which you'll be happy to know, has to be documented. So there still is that option for you to go it alone. It might not be the easiest way to go, but if you find that the bad actors have been limited to one specific unit of your company or one specific geography, you may prevent yourselves from having to go through a DOJ investigation and boil the sea.
Absolutely.
So next, Tom, the one we skipped over, why don't you pick up Tammy Whitehouse's article about time runs out on getting ready for new revenue recognition.
So for those who don't know, December 15th, 2017, today, is when new revenue recognition rules for customer contracts goes into effect. And this is going to significantly change the way you think about recognizing revenue, largely by putting much more judgments around the determination you make. Previously, revenue recognition was largely was rules-based. So the FASB, Financial Accounting Standards Board, has come up with this new rule. It has been was released in 2014. So there was a long lead up to this. Matt Kelly and I have both been visiting this issue over the last, certainly for me, 12 months, and I think Matt perhaps a little bit longer. This past week, we did a special 5-part podcast series on our podcast, Compliance Into the Weeds, where we took a short but deep dive into 5 different parts of the new RevRec standards. So this is something that companies need to be aware of. And the thing that why I think it's important that you and I talk about it, Jay, is it has significant implications for the compliance practitioner. This is really not something compliance had been a part of before in most corporations, revenue recognition. As a lawyer, an in-house lawyer, I was occasionally called to enforce the rules, but the rules were set. I didn't have to be a part of the creation of the rules or the interpretation of the rules within the organizations I was counsel in. So compliance needs to be aware of these. There's lots of room for, when you have room for judgment or you have calls for judgment, you have room for manipulation. And as Matt would say, that there's definitely potentials for fraud. And I see lots of potentials for fraud, specifically in the FCPA compliance context. So Tammy's got a good article kind of summarizing it from the accounting practitioner's perspective. Matt and I took a look at it. We looked at, we introduced the topic. We asked the question, what's your logic for your transaction price? We took a specific look into the software industry and how it's going to very much impact software. We looked at it from the auditor perspective, and then we wrapped it up looking at it really from the compliance professional perspective. So lots to think about. If you're a CCO or a compliance practitioner, you really need to go down and sit down and have a cup of coffee with your CFO or head of accounting. And if you're not up on these new rules, you need to get up on them, because companies have to report. They go into effect now, but you have to report under the new rules in your first reporting period, which for any company with a calendar year, fiscal year, will be in January or February. So this is not, next year's 10K. This is now. So lots to think about, and we've got some great resources listed there for you.
And what else have we been thinking about this week?
Well, I have been thinking a lot about Star Wars. I've been thinking about it, writing about it, talking about it, reading about it, ordering more books about it. My wife and I have gone back and rewatched 4, 5, 6, and we're going to do 7 tonight in anticipation of our noon Saturday tickets to go see Episode 8, The Last Jedi. And to even further honor this, you and I have done recorded a 5-part podcast series called May the Podcast Be With You, on the intersection of Star Wars and compliance, which will go up next week to really honor the premiere of the new Last Jedi episode 8. And if I could just summarize, I took a look at it. from the lens of Episode 4, A New Hope, where I considered what is risk. In Episode 5, The Empire Strikes Back, I looked at it from the due diligence perspective. In Episode 6, The Return of the Jedi, I looked at a good result, both in a movie and in compliance. And then in Episode 7, The Force Awakens, I looked at it from the perspective of disruptive innovation and compliance. I'd also note that our good friend Doug Cornelius, fellow Homer, who actually attends the Patriot games, as he regularly reminds me as they stomp on the Texans, he actually had a series as well. He had a little different perspective, unique to Doug, but he looked at it through the lens of hacking, from the stealing of the planets of the Death Star. He looked at telling the truth, or as he said it, lying. In the case of Obi-Wan Kenobi, not telling Luke that Darth Vader was his father. He compared bitcoins to cash in the context of the rebels consisting of making up the Rebel Rebellion and the Galactic Empire. And then he looked at R2-D2, C-3PO, and their work as machines in a post entitled Man versus Machine. So it was a great exploration by Doug. We've got links to all of those, my post, Doug's post. May the podcast be with you. We'll go up at noon each day next week. So I hope our listeners will take a look at or take a consideration of looking at our podcast each day in addition to our Friday podcast, Jay.
Perfect. So now we've got something from Sam Rubenfeld over at the Wall Street Journal, and he's talked about a new book called The Art of Sanctions, and he did an interview with its author, Richard Nephew. And what did you take away from it, Tom?
So first of all, actually, I met up with Sam a couple of weeks ago in New York. Had a chance to sit down and have a drink with him, and he was really excited about this interview. He has really studied sanctions a lot, and so he was very interested in the book. He's very interested in Richard Nephew, and unfortunately, Sam's constrained by a word count at the Risk and Compliance Journal, and so what was a fairly lengthy interview really had to condense down, but it's a fascinating interview. Richard Nephew previously had worked at, I think it was in Commerce and the State Department, and had been a part of the sanctions regime for a couple of other administrations. So he talked about how the role of Congress in sanctions, what makes an effective sanction program. He touched upon how the Trump administration has used its sanction power, and for all its blovation and bluster, he really said they're maintaining a fairly status quo approach. He talked about ancillary unintended consequences of sanctions. Then he took a look at two interesting terms, I thought, Jay: sanction overreach and sanction underreach. Underreach is the default of state of sanctions programs till the target says uncle. In the case of overreach, you impose such pressure, the target no longer sees any possibility of getting out from under the sanctions. And then he specifically talked about sanctions around the debt equity issues for Venezuela and Russia. And so it's going to be very interesting. Obviously, Venezuela is going to be a really hard and difficult sanctions issue with Citgo, because Citgo is an American corporation owned by Venezuelan government. The United States is going to have to do something about that, but that's going to cause a huge employment dislocation in certainly southern Texas and perhaps other places. And I can't remember who raised the point, but they said, does this mean that we're going to have to take the Citgo sign down in Boston? So think about that as a cultural icon and what those sanctions might mean.
Yeah, I mean, that really just, I can't fathom that. But the one thing you might want to consider doing, Tom, is seeing if you could get either both or one of them on your podcast, because if you could go deeper, like you're saying Sam did, it sounds like it could be a good, fascinating 30 or 40 minutes. Well,
that's certainly true.
Yeah. So then Also to Sam, he had a brief little article about HSBC as being the case that set compliance trends in modern banking. And, back in 2012, the settlement at that time was $1.92 billion. And that just the size of it and the scope of it blew a lot of people away. But the nice thing about the fact that they're now out from under their DPA, and really an opportunity to set up deal with the banking system. And I think it's been instructive for the other financial institutions and lays some groundwork for moving forward on similar type violations.
I would certainly agree with that. I think that was part of Sam's analysis as well. But the other part is certainly Sam touched on it and other commentators and other newspapers did. But I think we really have to give a tip of the hat to HSBC. This was a very robust DPA and very robust monitorship. They had a very stern monitor. And I think there was lots of times where there was I don't want to say acrimony, but certainly tension in the relationship with the monitor, and that the HSBC really had to make some significant cultural changes to be able to come out of this. So in addition to the points you raised, Jay, I think we owe a tip of the hat to HSBC. I've been under a monitorship in a corporation. I understand what that means and how difficult that can be. And for HSBC, a non-U.S. company, to come out really as well as they did, I think speaks very well to HSBC. There's lots of lessons learned for the anti-money laundering compliance community, but I think, Jay, for really the greater compliance community. And when you can open your article with the bank is released from its sword of Damocles, it's going to be a great story.
Mm-hmm.
Very Old Testament.
Now to our other good friend in Boston, Matt Kelly. What did Matt decide to write about this week besides the 5-part series of Into the Weeds?
So Matt really, and I mean really, got excised about Oliver Schmidt. Oliver Schmidt was a VW. He was a compliance officer, but it was really regulatory and engineering compliance, not sort of anti-corruption compliance. And he was arrested. He was a part of the VW emission testing scandal. His role was to lie to U.S. regulators about the emissions scandal and the defeat device. And he was aware of it. He had been communicated about it. He briefed senior management at Volkswagen about it. He may have talked to the board about it, communicated in emails about it. So there was no question he knew about the defeat device, and he lied to regulators. And the judge threw the book at him, 7 years. But that wasn't anything close to the book Matt threw at him. So Matt felt that the sentence was well-deserved, even though both the defense and prosecution had asked for 4 years. The judge gave him 7 years. And Matt really, he touched on it in his blog post, but then he really went into the weeds on it, as you might expect with a podcast called Compliance Into the Weeds, about the role of a compliance practitioner. And at what point does a compliance practitioner have to just stand up and say, no, I'm not going to lie, I'm not going to cheat, I'm not going to steal. And really, as a philosophical basis, how do you call yourself someone in compliance and still overtly, with intent, lie to government regulators on the industry that they are they are tasked with regulating? So we had a very interesting philosophical discussion about really what lies in the heart of man. And I really had not had that with Matt previously. So check out his blog post, check out the podcast. The Oliver Schmidt case is lots of lessons for the compliance practitioner. I will just tease with one, which is, if you're not subject to being extradited to the United States, do not come to the United States voluntarily to take your family to Disneyland. You will be arrested. So really interesting there.
So we got all through that now. What's happening on your monthly podcast series, Tom?
So this month I'm going through the use of best standards in a written compliance program or in a compliance program. And it's entitled 1 Month to Better Written Standards. I'm talking about codes of conduct, policy and procedures, drafting them, revising them, implementing them, training on them. In the last 2 weeks, I'm going through specific policies that I think you need: gifts, travel, entertainment, facilitation payment, third parties, extortion payments. I've thrown in some cybersecurity because that's such a hot topic. So it's really been a fun month. And the thing that's really driven home to me this month, Jay, is that written standards, your code of conduct, your policies and your procedures, and if you want to throw in internal controls, you can do that too. That's the backbone of your compliance program. And many of the things that you talk about, specifically in the context of affiliated monitors, where you guys will go test culture, or you will go test a reporting line, you will go test the robustness of a third-party program. Many of the things that I see you guys do and I hear you guys talk about, even to the point of technology and technological solutions to make your compliance program more efficient, they all lay upon the backbone and spine of the written standards, of the code of conduct, of the policy and procedures, and of the internal controls. And I've really come around to believing that they are the foundational documents of your compliance program. So that's perhaps not the most sexy thing about compliance, but it's certainly doing the spade work, the blocking and tackling, and putting that in, and then you can go overlay to have the sexy, higher profile, and perhaps more exciting work of compliance. But you've got to have a solid bed of written standards to start with.
Yeah, so that's, I couldn't have put it better myself. And then, more towards the part where you pick up is, how do you take those processes then and build them into your daily business regimen? And how do you make it not just compliance that's standing outside with a little c, but how do you make it big C compliance that's part of everything your business does and inoculates you and protects you along the way?
So we've talked about, Jay, the May the podcast be with you. I've loaded them up, and so I've been kind of excited to get to listen to them again. I certainly had a ton of fun with those, and I hope our listeners will enjoy that. I have a special logo design, so look for that. It will not be the standard This Week in FCPA. We have a special May the Podcast Be With You logo for this series. And Jay, I've promised our listeners that we had so much fun with this series that we will come back again in January and February and perhaps do another 5-part podcast series, this time dedicated to the Oscars on a kind of a shorter frame that we can do as well. So I hope we get some feedback from our fans and listeners on that series.
Awesome. Well, you know me, I'm always good for 1 or 2 Oscar stories. So I'm looking forward to it. And there is a ton of good movies out there to be seen. So if you can't get your tickets to The Last Jedi, there's certainly other things that are worthwhile that are in the theaters right now.
All right. Well, Jay, it looks like we're at the end. Do you want to take us home?
Sure. So on behalf of Tom Fox, the compliance evangelist, and myself, Jay Rosen, Mr. Monitor, we'd like to thank you for joining us for This Week in FCPA, Episode 80, The Last Jedi.
This is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of This Week in FCPA. If you have any questions on this episode, you can email me at tfox.